The moment Etta Vaughn spoke Henry Garrison's name aloud at the town meeting, every jaw in Caldwell, Kansas went slack, and Henry himself appeared in the doorway before the last syllable had even left her lips, his hat already in his hands, his dark eyes already searching for hers. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Caldwell sat like a dusty jewel on the southern edge of Kansas, pressed right up against the cattle trail that brought longhorns and trouble in equal measure. The Santa Fe Railroad had arrived 2 years prior, and with it came the promise of prosperity, the stink of cattle money, and the slow, grinding friction between those who had always lived on that land and those who intended to claim it forever. Caldwell was rough around its edges but warm at its center, a place where a widow could still run a boarding house without too much trouble, and where a man who kept mostly to himself could survive, if not exactly thrive. Henry Garrison kept to himself. That was the plain truth of it, and nobody in Caldwell would have argued the point. He occupied the last homestead on the western edge of town, a modest place with a good fence line and a kitchen garden that looked better tended than most people expected from a bachelor. He had arrived in Caldwell 3 years ago with a single horse, a bedroll, 2 changes of clothes, and a reputation that nobody could quite pin down. He was not unfriendly, exactly. He tipped his hat. He paid his debts at the general store on time. He helped old Mr. Farrow nail his porch boards back down after the spring floods without being asked. But he did not come to barn dances. He did not attend church socials. He had never once set foot inside the Silver Horn Saloon on a Friday night when the rest of the town's men gathered to drink and brag and argue about cattle prices. People had simply stopped thinking about Henry Garrison the way you stop thinking about a particular fence post. You know it is there, holding something up, but you do not invite it to supper. Etta Vaughn was a different kind of person entirely. She was 26 years old in that autumn of 1878, a woman who had buried a husband 2 years prior, and who had decided somewhere in the grief that followed that she was not going to let that loss turn her into something small. James Vaughn had been a good man, a decent farmer who loved her sincerely, and who had the misfortune of being thrown from his horse during a river crossing in the spring of 1876. The river had been running fast with snowmelt. He had not come up again. Etta had stood on the bank and screamed his name until her throat was raw, and then she had gone home and taken stock of what she had left. The boarding house her father had built before he died, 6 rooms, a good kitchen, a root cellar, and enough strength in her arms and enough iron in her spine to make something of it all. She had made something of it. By 1878, Etta Vaughn's boarding house was the cleanest establishment in Caldwell. The food was the best for 3 towns in any direction, and she was known for having a fair price and an even temper. She was also known for saying exactly what she thought, which some people found refreshing and others found alarming, depending on their tolerance for honesty. She had brown hair that she kept pinned up during the day, and that fell past her shoulders at night when she let it down in the privacy of her room. She had green eyes that caught the light in a way that made people glance twice, and she had a way of listening to a person that made them feel, for the duration of the conversation, that they were the most interesting person in the room. She was not looking for another husband. She had told her friend Clara Hodges this directly, on more than one occasion, and she had meant it each time she said it. But the story of Henry Garrison arriving in her doorway, the story of how it all began started not with romance at all, but with a problem. Specifically, it started with a water problem. The creek that fed the eastern edge of Caldwell had been running low all summer. By September it had slowed to a trickle, and by early October it was clear that if something was not done, several properties, including the boarding house, would be without reliable water before the first hard freeze. The town meeting was called on a Tuesday evening, held in the back room of the general store where Mayor Douglas Hatch presided over community decisions with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a man who had run for office thinking it would be mostly ceremonial. The room was crowded. Every lantern was lit. The air smelled of tobacco and leather, and the particular anxiety that settles over a gathering of people who all need water and are not sure who is going to do something about it. Mayor Hatch stood at the front and laid out the situation in plain terms. The creek needed digging out. The channel had silted up in 2 places, and there was a secondary spring about 1.5 miles west that could potentially be tapped if someone with the right knowledge laid in the proper pipe work. The town needed volunteers. The town needed someone who knew what they were doing. The room filled with the kind of murmuring that means everyone is hoping someone else will raise their hand first. Etta stood near the back, her arms crossed, listening. She had been thinking about the water problem for weeks. She had already walked the creek line herself twice, following it west into the scrubland past the edge of town, and she had found the secondary spring. She had noted the terrain, figured the rough grade of the land, thought about what would be needed. She was not an engineer, but she was practical, and she had read enough of her father's old farming manuals to understand the basic principle of moving water from one place to another. What she needed was someone who could do the physical work, someone with tools and time, and enough knowledge of the land to make it work properly. Her gaze moved around the room. The Purdy brothers were willing enough but were not known for precision. Tom Gibbons was skilled but had recently broken his wrist. Old Pharaoh was too old for that kind of labor. Jed Carey was strong and able but had already committed to driving a cattle herd north. She was going through names in her mind the way you go through a box of nails looking for the right size, discarding one after another, when her thoughts landed on Henry Garrison. She was a little surprised at herself. Henry Garrison. She tried to think of why she had thought of him exactly. She knew, in the vague way you know things about people in a small town, that he had worked on irrigation projects before he came to Caldwell. Someone had mentioned it once, casually, in the context of something else entirely. She believed it had been the hardware store owner, Mr. Pratt, who had mentioned it while commenting on a particular type of pipe fitting Henry had ordered. She had filed it away without meaning to, the way a practical mind files away useful information, and now it surfaced. She also knew, in a more direct way, that his property had the best-looking kitchen garden in town, which meant he understood water, understood soil, understood how to make things grow in a place that was not naturally inclined to help you. That was no small thing. She opened her mouth at the meeting, raising her voice over the general murmuring. "Has anyone thought to ask Henry Garrison?" she said. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when a name is mentioned that nobody expected to hear. People looked at each other. Someone near the front cleared his throat. Mayor Hatch looked mildly confused, as though he were trying to place the name. "Henry Garrison," Etta repeated, because she had not asked a question she was not willing to push. "He lives on the western edge. His property is well maintained. I have it on good account that he has worked on irrigation before. He knows this land. He has been here 3 years and nobody has asked him for a thing. I think we should ask." The room was still digesting this when the door at the back opened. Henry Garrison stood in the frame. He had not been invited. He had no way of knowing what was being said, or so everyone in that room assumed. He had simply come, perhaps drawn by the lights, perhaps because the gathering of his neighbors had snagged some peripheral awareness in him as he passed. He was 30 years old, lean and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that wanted cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in a few days. He was wearing his work clothes, which were clean but plain, and he was holding his hat with both hands in that way a man holds his hat when he is trying to show he means no trouble. His dark eyes found Etta Vaughn's green ones across the crowded room and held them for a moment that lasted, she would later think, considerably longer than a moment ought to. "Miss Vaughn," he said, and his voice was low and clear. "Did I hear my name?" She felt the warmth rise in her face and ignored it. "You did," she said. "I was just saying that you might be exactly the person we need. We have a water problem." "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about it for 2 weeks." She blinked. "Have you?" "Yes, ma'am." He stepped fully into the room, letting the door fall shut behind him. "I walked the creek line last Sunday." There are 2 points of significant silting, one about a quarter-mile east and one just past the Pratt property. There is also a spring to the west that I believe could be brought in with about 300 feet of iron pipe and a day of decent grade work. I have the pipe measurements written down at home if anyone wants to see them." The room was profoundly silent. Mayor Hatch cleared his throat. "Well," he said, that is very good information, Mr. Garrison." Henry Garrison was not looking at the mayor. He was still looking at Etta, and she was still looking at him, and she had the strangest feeling that something had just shifted in the architecture of her life, quietly and without warning, the way a small stone at the top of a hill shifts before it begins to roll. "I was going to come to someone about it," Henry said, his eyes finally moving to the room at large. "I just was not sure who to go to. I am glad someone asked." He glanced back at Etta when he said that last part. She lifted her chin a little and gave him a small, measured nod as if to say, "Yes, that is exactly how things ought to work, and you are welcome." He held her gaze for one more beat, and then looked away, but she caught the corner of his mouth moving, just barely, in something that was not quite a smile but was very close to one. The meeting reorganized itself around Henry Garrison's presence with a speed that told Etta how much the town had simply forgotten to include him. He spread his notes, actual hand-drawn notes on good paper, precise and detailed, across the counter of the general store, and men who had previously not thought about him at all were now leaning in, pointing at his sketches, asking him questions that he answered with quiet competence. He knew what he was talking about. That was clear within minutes. He had clearly thought about it far more than anyone else had, and he had done so alone, without anyone asking him to, simply because it needed thinking about, and he was the kind of man who thought about things that needed attention. Etta watched him from across the room and found herself doing something she had not done in 2 years. She was noticing a man, not cataloging him the way you catalog a neighbor, assessing his usefulness to the community, but actually noticing him. The way his hands moved over the paper when he was explaining something, sure and deliberate. The way he listened to other men's questions without any impatience, even when the questions were not very good questions. The way he did not try to take up more space than he needed in the room, even though he probably could have, given that he was the most competent person in it. She told herself this was not relevant information. She had a boarding house to run. She had guests to feed in the morning. She was not in the market for complications. She walked home alone through the cool October night, her boots quiet on the packed dirt of the main street, the stars overhead so thick and white they looked like salt spilled on a dark cloth. She was thinking about water rights and pipe fittings, she told herself. She was absolutely thinking about water rights and pipe fittings. She was not thinking about dark eyes that held hers across a crowded room. The water project began the following Monday, and because it was her idea, and because Etta Vaughn was not a woman who suggested something and then stepped back from it, she was there at the creek line when Henry arrived with his tools just after first light. She had brought coffee in a tin pot and a cloth-wrapped bundle of biscuits from her morning's baking, because she was practical and because men worked better when they had eaten, and for no other reason. Henry arrived to find her standing in the gray morning light with coffee steam rising from the pot she held, and he stopped for just a moment when he saw her, the way a man stops when he encounters something he did not expect. "Miss Vaughn," he said. "Mr. Garrison," she said. "Coffee." "Yes, please." She poured him a cup. Their fingers did not touch when she handed it to him. She made sure of that not out of propriety but because she did not trust herself to be as unaffected as she wanted to be, and unaffected was the only way she knew how to move through the world right now. He wrapped both hands around the tin cup and looked out at the creek. The morning was still cool enough to see their breath. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the grass to the north. "You walked this line yourself," he said. It was not a question. "I did," she said. "You found the secondary spring." "I did." He nodded slowly, like he was confirming something to himself. Most people wouldn't have thought to look that far west, he said. Most people are waiting for someone else to solve their problems, she said. He glanced at her then, and there was something in the look that was different from how men usually looked at her, not assessment, not the particular evaluating quality she had grown accustomed to as a widow running a business on her own. It was more like recognition. Like he was seeing something he understood. That is true, he said quietly. I have noticed that about most people. You have been here 3 years, she said, because she had been curious about this and she was too direct to circle around it. You know the land, you clearly pay attention. Why have you not come forward before about the water problem or anything else? He was quiet for a moment. He took a sip of the coffee. Down at the creek, a great blue heron lifted from the shallow water and carried itself away on slow, deliberate wings. I was not sure I was wanted, he said finally. The honesty of it was so plain and so unguarded that she felt it land somewhere behind her sternum. You were not asked, she said carefully. That is not the same thing. It can feel the same, he said. She thought about that. She thought about a man who had walked this creek line alone on a Sunday, made careful notes, thought through the whole problem, and then waited not from laziness, not from disinterest, but from some particular private uncertainty about whether his presence and his ideas would be welcome. She thought about 3 years of barn dances he had not attended, of church socials he had stayed away from, of Friday nights at the saloon where his absence had simply become unremarkable. She thought it was a great waste, and she said so. That is a great waste, she said, of your knowledge and of your time. He looked at her with those dark eyes again. Possibly, he said. But I am here now. You are here now, she agreed. They stood in the cooling morning and drank their coffee, and then they went to work. The water project took 11 days. Not because it was so complicated, but because the hard Kansas soil did not give itself up easily, and because the pipe work was precise and could not be rushed, and because there were 3 other men helping, the Purdy brothers and young Will Dorsey, and coordinating 4 people on a project is always slower than one person working alone. Henry directed with a calm authority that the other men respected after the first day of seeing what he could do. He was not a man who shouted or ordered. He explained, demonstrated, worked alongside. He was the first one there in the morning and the last one to leave in the evening. Etta brought food every day. She told herself this was practical. The men were working hard and needed fuel. She had a kitchen and the habits of a woman who fed people as her primary occupation. It was not a special accommodation for Henry Garrison. It was simply what made sense. On the 4th day, when the others had gone home for supper and Henry was still on his knees at the secondary spring, fitting the last junction of iron pipe into its bed of tamped earth, she sat down on the bank above him and watched him work in the fading copper light of the October evening. You are going to lose the light in 20 minutes, she said. I know, he said. I just want to get this joint set before the temperature drops. The ground will be harder tomorrow and I will lose an hour to it. She watched his hands move. He was not wearing gloves despite the chill because you could not feel the fit of a pipe joint through leather. Where did you learn this? She asked. He did not look up. My father built irrigation systems in Missouri, then further west. I grew up following him around, handing him tools, eventually doing more than that. Where is he now? Dead, he said simply. 3 years ago, that is why I came west. There was nothing holding me in Missouri after that. She absorbed this. What about your mother? Gone longer than that. He fitted the joint, pressed it firmly, tested it with his hands. There, that will hold. He sat back on his heels and looked up at her. The last of the sunset was behind her, and she was probably just a silhouette to him, but she was suddenly very aware of the smallness of the distance between them. I am sorry about your father, she said. I am sorry about your husband, he said. I heard about that when I first came to town, she nodded slowly. People will tell strangers everything if the strangers are new enough. They told me he was a good man, Henry said. He was, she said. He was a genuinely good man. She paused. I was fortunate to have loved someone genuinely good, even if the time was short. Henry was looking at her steadily from his position below her on the bank. His expression was careful, respectful, attentive. "You do not talk like most people talk about grief," he said. "How do most people talk about grief? Like it is something to apologize for, or something to hide as quickly as possible." She thought about this. "I'm not ashamed of having loved someone," she said. "The grief is just proof of the love. I'm not going to apologize for either." He held her gaze for a long moment in the dusk. Something quiet moved in his face, something that looked like it might be admiration, though he kept it carefully measured. "No," he said, "I would not expect you to." She looked away first because she needed to. She looked out at the flat Kansas horizon, where the last light was bleeding out of the sky. The prairie so immense and indifferent and beautiful that it made a person feel very small and very alive at the same time. "The pipe will be finished by Wednesday," she said, bringing herself back. "Yes," he said, "by Wednesday." She stood up, brushed the grass from her skirt, and picked up the empty coffee pot she had brought with her. "Good night, Mr. Garrison," she said. "Good night, Miss Vaughn," he said. She walked back toward town with the empty pot and the curious fullness of a conversation that had said, she suspected, considerably more than its words. The water project was completed on a Wednesday afternoon, exactly as predicted. Henry opened the channel connection, and they all stood and watched the clean water from the secondary spring run through the new pipe into the main creek, and the Purdy brothers whooped and slapped each other on the back. And young Will Dorsey threw his hat in the air, and Mayor Hatch arrived 20 minutes later. He had not lifted a shovel but somehow arrived in time for the celebration, and shook everyone's hand with great enthusiasm, including Henry's, and said it was exactly the kind of community spirit that made Caldwell great. Etta watched Henry accept the handshake and the mayor's words with a quiet courtesy that did not quite conceal the faint stiffness of a man who had done the actual work and was being thanked by a man who had not. She caught his eye over the mayor's shoulder and gave him a small, private look that said she knew the difference, and the corner of his mouth shifted in that not quite a smile again. That evening there was an impromptu gathering at the general store. Someone produced a jug, someone else brought a fiddle, and within an hour there was food and music and the easy, warm noise of people who had accomplished something together. Henry was there, which was itself a small event in the history of Caldwell. People kept looking at him as though recalibrating. Clara Hodges, who was Etta's closest friend in town and who noticed everything, sidled up to Etta near the stove and spoke in a low, pointed voice. "Henry Garrison is at a social gathering," Clara said. "He is," Etta agreed. "He came because of you. He came because the project is finished and he was invited the same as everyone else." "Etta," Clara said with the particular weight of a woman who has been friends with another woman long enough to dispense with gentleness when necessary, "he has looked at you 4 times in the past 10 minutes and you have looked at him 3 times. I have been counting." "Clara, I am not suggesting anything. I am simply counting." Etta pressed her lips together. "The fiddle is very nice tonight," she said. Clara laughed into her cup. "Absolutely," she said. "The fiddle is wonderful." Across the room, Henry was talking with old Mr. Farrow, who had apparently decided that Henry was his new favorite person on the basis of the water project, and was now subjecting him to what appeared to be a lengthy account of the 1872 drought. Henry was listening with apparent genuine interest. He was good at listening. Etta had noticed that. He did not listen with the performance of patience that most men used, the slight restlessness, the waiting for their turn to speak. He actually listened with his whole attention, as if whatever was being said to him was the most important thing currently happening. It was, she had concluded privately, a very attractive quality. He looked up then as though he felt her watching, and their eyes met across the room. He did not look away quickly in the way of a person caught doing something they should not be doing. He held the look for a moment, steady and unhurried, and then he gave her the smallest, most private nod, as if to say, "I see you too," and then he looked back at old Mr. Farrow and the drought of 1872. Etta turned away and found herself smiling at the wall, which was embarrassing, so she went to get more coffee. 2 weeks passed. The water now flowed reliably, and the town of Caldwell moved on to its next set of concerns, which in the autumn of 1878 included cattle prices, a disputed land claim to the south, and the upcoming winter preparation that demanded everyone's attention. Life in a Kansas cattle town was not slow. There was always something pressing at the door. Henry Garrison returned to his property on the western edge of town, and Etta returned to her boarding house, and the daily business of their separate lives resumed. But something had changed in the way the town held Henry. He had been seen. His usefulness and his knowledge were now part of the community's awareness of itself. People said good morning to him with more intention. Mr. Pratt at the hardware store started a tab for him without being asked. The Purdy brothers waved him over when they were sitting outside the barbershop on Saturday afternoons, and Etta found herself looking west when she was in her kitchen garden, which faced that direction, more often than strictly made sense given that Henry Garrison's property was not visible from there. It was Clara who finally said what needed saying. On a Thursday morning in mid-November, when the two of them were putting up the last of the season's preserves in Etta's kitchen, the jars steaming on the counter and the apple smell filling the warm room. "You should invite him to Thanksgiving," Clara said. Etta did not pretend she did not know who was meant. "That is a family gathering," she said. "I always do a family-style meal for the boarding house guests who have nowhere to go. Henry Garrison has his own home. Henry Garrison will eat alone on Thanksgiving unless someone asks him not to," Clara said. "You know this is true." Etta did know. She had thought about it already more than once, in the early mornings when she was starting the kitchen fire and the light was still gray outside, and her mind went to places she had not given it permission to go. "It would be," she began carefully, "a very natural thing to invite him. He helped the town significantly. He has no family nearby. It is simply the neighborly thing." "It is absolutely the neighborly thing," Clara agreed, with perfect serenity. Etta set down the jar lid she had been holding. She untied her apron and hung it on its hook by the door. She walked out the front door of the boarding house and down the front steps and turned west on the main street, which was the direction of Henry Garrison's property. She walked at a good, brisk pace, with the purpose of a woman who had decided something and was going to see it through before she could talk herself out of it. The morning was cold but clear. The sky was the hard, particular blue of late autumn in Kansas, and the grass in the open lots between buildings had gone the color of old gold. Her boots were firm on the frozen dirt of the street. She walked the length of the main street and then the narrower track that led west past the edge of the last building, out where the town thinned and the prairie reasserted itself, and she saw Henry's property, the good fence, the house with its freshly repaired boards, the kitchen garden put to bed for the winter under a layer of straw. He was in the yard. He was splitting wood, which was such a perfectly self-sufficient thing to be doing that she very nearly smiled. He had his back to her when she came through the gate, and he heard the latch and turned around. He was wearing a heavy canvas jacket, and there was a look of mild surprise on his face that softened immediately when he saw who it was. "Miss Vaughn," he said. "Mr. Garrison," she said. "I am going to do a Thanksgiving meal at the boarding house. The guests who have nowhere to go, some of the neighbors, I would like you to come." He looked at her. He looked at her long enough that she became aware of her own heartbeat. "You would," he said. "I would," she said. And then, because honesty was the only currency she dealt in, "I am not going to pretend it is only because you helped with the water project, though that is certainly a good reason. I would like you to be there because I think I would like your company at my table." The look on his face then was something she was not sure she had words for. It was not just surprise, though there was surprise in it. It was something quieter and more complicated than that. It was the look of a man to whom something has been offered that he had not known to hope for. "Yes," he said, "I will be there." "Thursday," she said, "noon." "I will bring something," he said. "What do you need?" "I have the food managed," she said. "Just bring yourself." "That," he said, and his voice was just slightly different than it had been a moment before, warmer in some way she could not have measured, "I can do." She nodded once briskly the way she did when she had accomplished a task. She turned and walked back toward the gate. She had her hand on the latch when he spoke behind her. "Miss Vaughn," he said. She turned. "Thank you," he said, "for thinking to invite me." She looked at him across the bare yard with the cold Kansas sky immense above them both, and she said, because it was true, "You should have been invited sooner. That was our failing, not yours." She walked back to town. She had the most unreasonable impulse to skip, which she did not act on because she was 26 years old and a business owner and a widow, and widows did not skip down Kansas roads in November. But she did, walking home, feel something she had not felt in 2 years, something that rose in her chest like the first pale light before an actual sunrise, not yet the full thing, not yet warm enough to call by its real name, but undeniably there, undeniably alive, leaning toward the east. Thanksgiving was 12 people at 2 pushed-together tables in the main room of the boarding house, which Etta had set with her best tablecloths and the brass candlesticks her mother had left her, and which smelled, from early morning onward, of roasting turkey and sage stuffing and the deep, sweet smell of 2 pies that had been in the oven since dawn. Her current boarders were a traveling land surveyor named Caldwell, which caused endless confusion given the town's name, a young schoolteacher named Miss Perkins, who was in her first year and still somewhat bewildered by everything, and 2 cattle buyers who came through regularly and had developed a preference for Etta's cooking over the hotel's. Clara and her husband Tom were there, and old Mr. Farrow, who had no family left and who Etta always included without making a production of it, and the Dorsey boy's mother, who was a widow herself with 3 children under 10 who arrived in a cheerful chaos and immediately made the gathering louder and more alive. Henry arrived exactly at noon, which was exactly when she had said noon, which she found privately satisfying. He had not brought nothing despite her saying not to bring anything. He had brought a jar of honey from his own bees. She had not known he kept bees, and a wrapped bundle that turned out to be a very decent bottle of brandy, which he set on the side table without fanfare. "You kept that information quiet," she said, looking at the honey. "Which information?" he said. "The bees." "I keep many things quiet," he said. "The bees are one of them." "What else?" she said. He looked at her. There was a warmth in his face that had not been there at the first meeting, or perhaps that had been there, but that she had not been positioned to see. "I suppose you will find out," he said, "over time." She felt that rise in her chest again, bright and unmistakable. "Come in," she said. "Let me take your coat." The meal was everything it should have been, which is to say it was loud and warm and full of the particular grace of people who have gathered honestly and who are genuinely glad to be together. The children ran and were corralled and ran again. Old Mr. Farrow told 3 separate stories, each of which began with a different year and ended somehow at the same punchline about a Missouri mule. The land surveyor, it turned out, had a gift for card tricks, which he demonstrated over the remnants of the pie to the children's absolute delight. Miss Perkins, the schoolteacher, had a lovely singing voice, which nobody had known until Tom Hodges produced a harmonica and things got musical. Henry Garrison sat at Etta's right, which was where she had put him, and talked with the people around him with an ease she had not predicted, and which she found herself watching with something that felt distinctly like pride. He was different in the warmth of the room, with food and firelight and the good noise of people around him. Not louder exactly, but less contained. He laughed at Mr. Farrow's mule story with a genuine, full laugh that she did not see coming, and that made her breath catch a little. He helped the youngest of the Dorsey children get the turkey off her fork without making a production of it. He talked with Miss Perkins about whether the schoolhouse needed a new stovepipe, which it apparently did, and told her how to go about requisitioning one from the county, which was apparently something he knew. At one point Clara, from across the table, looked at Etta with an expression of absolute serenity that said, quite clearly, "I told you so," and Etta looked back at her with an expression that said, equally clearly, "I know, and you do not need to be so pleased with yourself about it," and Clara smiled into her apple brandy. After the meal, when the children were asleep in a heap by the fire and the adults were lingering in that pleasant, overfull, slow way of people after a good Thanksgiving meal, Henry and Etta ended up side by side on the back porch, where the cold was a relief after the warm room. The sky was immense and full of stars. The town was quiet. Somewhere to the south, a coyote sang once and was answered and then went silent. "Thank you for including me," he said. "Thank you for coming," she said. A comfortable quiet settled between them. She was aware of the fact that their shoulders were approximately 6 inches apart, which was closer than they had stood before, and she was also aware of the warmth of him in the cold air, which was not something she was supposed to be cataloging but was doing so anyway. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "When you came to that meeting, the night I said your name, you were in the doorway almost before I had finished saying it." She looked at him. "How did you know to come?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark prairie. "I was walking past," he said. "I saw the lights. I have walked past those kinds of lights before and not gone in. I do not know why that night was different." He paused. "I heard your voice when I was at the door. I could not make out the words, but I heard your voice, and I went in." She absorbed this with care. "You heard my voice specifically," she said. "Yes," he said simply. "I heard your voice and I went in." There was nothing she could say to that was adequate, so she said nothing, and they stood in the cold night together, shoulder to shoulder now, not quite touching, both of them looking out at the enormous Kansas dark. "Henry," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. "Yes," he said, and she heard the awareness of it in his voice. "I am glad you came in," she said. He turned to look at her, and in the faint light spilling from the kitchen window she could see the full, unguarded quality of his expression. "So am I," he said. "Etta," her name in his voice. She was not prepared for how that felt. She was very much not prepared for that. She looked back out at the stars. "It is cold," she said. "It is," he agreed. "We should probably go back inside." "Probably," he said. Neither of them moved for a full, suspended minute. Then the youngest Dorsey child woke up and began to cry, and the moment was broken, and they went back inside, and the evening continued, and eventually people gathered their coats and their children and made their goodbyes, and Henry was the last to leave, and at the door he took her hand very briefly, just for a moment, and held it. "Good night, Etta," he said. "Good night, Henry," she said. She closed the door and leaned her back against it in the empty, warm, good-smelling house and let herself feel, fully and honestly, the thing that she had been managing at arm's length for weeks. She was falling in love with Henry Garrison. Well, she thought, that was something. December came to Caldwell with a hard freeze and a blizzard that lasted 3 days and left the prairie buried in white. The cattle trail south went quiet. The town pulled itself inward, the way prairie towns did in winter, all warmth and proximity and the business of survival. Etta's boarding house was full, the fire kept roaring, and she baked enough bread to feed the state of Kansas. Henry came every other day to bring firewood, which she had not asked him to do. He appeared the morning after the blizzard with a full cord of split wood loaded in a wagon behind his horse, and when she opened the door and found him there, she felt something so warm move through her that she had to look at the wood specifically for a moment to collect herself. "You did not need to do this," she said. "Your pile was running low," he said. "I could see it when I walked past." "You walk past often enough to observe my wood pile," she said. He looked at her with perfect steadiness. "Yes," he said, in the tone of a man who has made his peace with a truth and is simply telling it. She stepped back to let him bring the wood in. He stacked it by the back door with the same precision he brought to everything, the wood evenly positioned, the pile stable and correct. She made him coffee, and he sat at her kitchen table for the first time, and she sat across from him, and they talked for 2 hours. This became a pattern through December and into January, Henry coming by. ostensibly for practical reasons that became progressively less necessary as an excuse over time, and the two of them talking in her kitchen while the cold pressed against the windows and the fire was good and warm. They talked about everything. He told her about Missouri and about following his father through the river bottoms where the water moved in ways that still shaped how he thought about landscape. She told him about her father and the boarding house, about the years of learning to cook and manage accounts and make something functional out of something that had very nearly fallen apart. She told him about James, and he listened without flinching, the way a person listens when they actually want to understand rather than when they are waiting to say something reassuring. He told her about the years after his father died, the wandering quality of them, the way he had moved west without a specific destination, because moving felt better than being still in a place that only reminded him of loss. "Is that why you came to Caldwell specifically?" she asked him one January afternoon. Snow was falling in large, soft flakes outside the kitchen window, and the light was the particular pearl gray of a Kansas snowstorm. "I stopped when I found a piece of land I did not want to leave immediately," he said. "That felt like enough of a sign. What made you not want to leave?" He was quiet for a moment, considering. "The light here in the morning," he said. "This particular kind of light that comes across the open ground when the sun is coming up. I had never seen anything else quite like it. I thought, if I stay here, I will be able to see that light every morning. That seemed worth staying for." She looked at him. "That is the most beautiful reason I have ever heard for settling in a place," she said honestly. He looked at her with that direct, unhurried quality that she had come to understand was simply how he gave people his full attention. "There are better reasons now," he said quietly, "for staying." The snow fell outside, the fire crackled. She held his gaze and felt the warmth in it as directly and genuinely as she felt the warmth from the stove. "Henry," she said. "Yes." She was very aware in that moment of the precision required of words. "I have not been in the habit of hoping for things," she said carefully. "Since James, I closed that particular door. I was quite deliberate about it." He waited. He did not rush her. "I find that it may be opening again," she said. "Of its own accord mostly. Which I mention because I would rather you know what is happening on my side of things than have you uncertain about it." He looked at her for a long, full moment. And then he reached across the kitchen table and set his hand, very gently, over hers where it rested on the table. His hand was warm and rough, and there was something in the steadiness of it, the simple and certain way it covered hers, that made her feel something unknot in her chest that she had not known was knotted. "I have known what I am hoping for since about the 4th day of the water project," he said. "I have simply been waiting to be sure you knew it too." She turned her hand over under his and held it. "I know it," she said. Outside, the snow fell soft and thick on Caldwell, Kansas, on the quiet Main Street and the bare fields and the sleeping cattle trail. Inside the kitchen of the boarding house, Henry Garrison and Etta Vaughn sat at a table with their hands together and the fire burning, and allowed themselves, with great care and great honesty, to begin. The winter unfolded around them the way a winter does when you have something warm and true to move through it with, not easier, exactly, but different. The cold was still cold and the work was still work and the days were still short and the nights were long. But there was a quality of anticipation to the mornings now, and an ease to the evenings that Etta had not had for a long time. They were careful with each other. That was the word for it, careful. Not cautious in a fearful way, but careful in the way you are careful with something that matters, attentive to it, not rushing. Henry did not press. Etta did not retreat. They existed in an in-between space that felt, most of the time, like the gentlest possible progression towards something that was going to be very good. Clara, naturally, had opinions. "The whole town can see it, you know," she said to Etta in February, when Etta came to help her with a quilt project and made the error of mentioning Henry's name in a context that Clara found meaningful. "They are all talking about it." "Let them talk," Etta said. "I am not saying it is a bad thing," Clara said. I am saying it is a public thing now, and you should probably both know that. Old Mr. Farrow has apparently bet the hardware store owner $1 that Henry will ask you to marry him before spring. Etta's needle stopped moving. He has not done that. He absolutely has. I heard it from Mrs. Pratt directly. Well, Etta said. She resumed sewing. Mr. Farrow can keep his $1. Nobody is asking anyone anything. Yet, said Clara. You are impossible, said Etta. I am entirely right, said Clara. In early March, when the snow was breaking up and the first tentative green was coming through in the low places along the creek, there was an incident in Caldwell that brought everything into a different kind of clarity. The land dispute to the south that had been quietly simmering since autumn came to a head. A cattle operation from Texas, Hardin Brothers Cattle Company, which had significant money and significant lawyers, and a willingness to use both in ways that were not entirely scrupulous, had filed a claim on land that included a portion of the western edge of Caldwell, specifically the area where Henry's homestead was situated. The claim was based on a survey error from 1873, and the Hardin brothers had paid handsomely to have that survey error presented as a legitimate land boundary. Henry received notice of the claim on a Tuesday morning, by way of a rider who delivered a legal document and left without making conversation. He read the document at his kitchen table, and then he walked into town and went to the boarding house. Etta read the document at her kitchen table while Henry stood by the window. When she finished, she set it down and looked up at him. This is fabricated, she said. I know, he said. The survey they are citing was contested at the time. I remember my father talking about it. He had property dealings in that area in '73, and the survey was never properly recorded. She stood up. I know where the original land office records would be, in Wichita. Henry looked at her. Etta, he said carefully, this is my problem. It is your property, she said. But problems do not stop at people's fence lines around here. If the Hardin brothers push this claim and it succeeds, there are 4 other properties they will come after next, and you know it, including mine. He was quiet. Besides which, she said, and her voice was level and clear, you are not going to fight this alone, not when I can help. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was not quite what she expected, not gratitude exactly, though that was in it. Something more private and more moved than gratitude. Etta, he said quietly. Do not say it is not my fight, she said. I was not going to say that, he said. I was going to say that I am not accustomed to having someone stand next to me this way, and I am very aware of it. She held his look for a beat, and then she picked up the document and her coat. We are going to the mayor's office, she said, and then we are going to draft a letter to the land office in Wichita. Do you have copies of your original homestead papers? At home, he said. Get them, she said. He went and got them. The fight with the Hardin Brothers Cattle Company took 6 weeks and involved 3 letters to the Wichita Land Office, the testimony of 2 witnesses who had been present at the original 1873 survey, and a Sunday afternoon where Etta sat at her kitchen table and wrote a 12-page summary of the legal and historical evidence that was so clearly and precisely argued that the county attorney, when he read it, asked who her lawyer was. She told him she did not have one. He stared at her. She handed him the coffee she had poured for him and asked him to continue reading. Henry was there for all of it. He brought his own papers and his own memory of the land, and he helped where he could, and he was an honest and capable presence through the whole thing. But he also knew, and was not too proud to know it, that Etta's clarity of mind and her stubborn, precise way with information was the engine of it. He said so directly, when the Hardin brothers withdrew the claim in late March and the whole thing was settled. You did that, he said. They were standing at her front door in the mild early evening, the first real warmth of spring in the air, a robin singing somewhere in the elm tree by the fence. We did that, she said. He shook his head gently. You did a great deal of it. Henry, she said, and looked at him directly. You would have done it without me. It would have taken longer and cost more, but you would have gotten there. Maybe, he said, but I am very glad I did not have to find out. He was looking at her with that full, unhurried attention of his, and the evening light was warm and golden and the robin was singing, and she was suddenly, acutely aware of how much she loved this man. Not the careful, managed version of the feeling she had been tending for months, but the full, clear, undeniable version of it standing right in front of her in the evening light. She loved him. That was the simple and enormous truth of it. "Henry," she said. "Yes," he said, and his voice had changed. "I think you should probably kiss me," she said. "If that is something you are thinking about." He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved, and then the movement became a full, real smile, the kind she had not seen from him before, wide and warm and transforming the whole quality of his face. "It is something I have been thinking about for approximately 5 months," he said. "Then stop thinking about it," she said. He stepped forward, and his hands came up to frame her face with that same careful, precise quality he brought to everything. And he kissed her in the spring evening with the robin singing and the elm tree moving in the gentle wind. And it was, she thought, exactly what a first kiss ought to be, not rushed, not tentative, not uncertain, but certain and warm and honest, exactly like the man himself. When they stepped back from each other, she had her hands against his chest and could feel his heartbeat, which was, she noted with satisfaction, not entirely steady. "Hello," she said. He laughed softly. "Hello," he said. Spring opened around them. The cattle trail came alive again, with the sound of longhorns moving north, the drovers trailing them through on their way to the railhead, and the town of Caldwell buzzed with the return of commerce and movement after the long winter quiet. Etta's boarding house was full from late March onward, every room occupied by cattle buyers and landmen, and the various travelers that the trail brought through. She cooked from before dawn until well after dark, and she was exhausted and satisfied by her work in the way that she always was when the busy season came. Henry and Etta had what you might call a courtship, though it was a very Etta and Henry kind of courtship, practical and honest and full of real conversation, with less ceremony than feeling. He came to supper twice a week at the boarding house, the community supper table that included the guests, and nobody in Caldwell thought this required much comment at this point because the whole town had seen it coming since approximately October. He walked with her on Sunday afternoons when she could take a few hours from the kitchen, west out of town along the creek that was now running strong and clean thanks to his work, and they talked about everything and nothing, and the prairie was enormous and generous around them. They talked about the future, carefully at first, and then more directly as spring became summer. Henry had expanded his homestead garden and was thinking about adding a small orchard. Etta was considering whether the boarding house needed a third table in the dining room, given the volume of business. These were separate conversations, but they were happening with an increasingly clear awareness that they were also, in some sense, one conversation. It was Henry who said it plainly, which surprised her a little, though perhaps it should not have. On a July evening, they were sitting on the bank of the creek in the long summer light, the water running clear and cool, and the cottonwood trees making their particular soft sound in the slight breeze, when Henry set down the piece of grass he had been turning in his hands and looked at her. "Etta," he said. She looked at him. She already knew from the quality of his voice that this was a different kind of moment. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I want to do it properly with whatever you need me to do. I want to be clear about what I am asking. I am asking you to be my wife, and I am asking you to let me be your husband, and I am asking if we can build something together." He paused. "I am also asking because I love you, and I have been trying to find a way to say that that is adequate, and I do not think there is one, so I am just saying it. I love you." She looked at him in the summer evening light, this man who had come to her town 3 years ago and been invisible until she said his name, who had been in the doorway before she finished saying it, who had worked and listened and been exactly himself with such consistency and such honesty that she had not been able to resist it for even one moment once she started paying attention. "Henry Garrison," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since November, at the very least, and probably sooner than that, but November is when I stopped being able to pretend otherwise. Something moved across his face, something very full and very quiet and very certain. "Is that a yes?" he said. She laughed, and then she said, "Yes, that is absolutely yes." He reached out and took her hand, and they sat on the bank of the creek in the long July light with the cottonwoods moving overhead, and she thought that this was one of those moments you would remember for the rest of your life, not because anything dramatic happened in it, but because of the absolute and unrepeatable rightness of it, the way it fit perfectly into the shape of what your life was supposed to be. They were married in September of 1879, exactly 1 year after the water project, at the church on the north end of Caldwell. The minister was a decent man named Pastor Wells, who kept the ceremony both meaningful and reasonably brief, which Etta had specifically requested. Clara was her attendant, in a role that she took extremely seriously, and that involved a great deal of opinion about flower arrangements. Old Mr. Farrow was in the front row and wept openly throughout the whole ceremony without any apparent embarrassment. The Dorsey children threw grass seed instead of rice, because the Dorsey mother could not source enough rice on short notice, which turned out to be perfect and very funny. Henry stood at the front of the church in his good suit, which was a dark charcoal color and fit him well, because Etta had brought the tailor from Wichita 2 weeks prior and stood in the shop and supervised the fitting, and watched her come down the aisle with the expression of a man who can barely believe his own good fortune, which was, Etta thought, exactly the right expression for a man to have at his wedding. She was wearing the cream-colored dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit her properly, with her brown hair down for once, falling in waves over her shoulders, and she carried a small bunch of late summer wildflowers that Henry had picked himself that morning from the field behind his property. Their property. She had corrected herself on that point already and intended to continue doing so. When Pastor Wells said the words and asked if she took this man, she said yes with a steadiness that matched Henry's own, and when they kissed at the end of the ceremony, the whole church made a sound that was equal parts warm approval and delight, and old Mr. Farrow cried harder. The celebration afterward was at the boarding house, which had been closed for regular business for the day and which had been scrubbed and decorated within an inch of its life by Clara, and a coalition of women who had apparently been planning for weeks without telling Etta directly, producing an effect that was genuinely lovely and that made her stop in the doorway for a moment when she first saw it. Henry stood at her shoulder. "Did you know about this?" he said softly. "I absolutely did not," she said. "Clara," he said. "Clara," she agreed. The fiddle player from the general store celebration had been retained, and he was very good, and there was dancing that went on until the moon was high. Henry danced with Etta twice, and she had not known he could dance, and he was better than she expected, and she told him so, and he said his mother had been firm about it, and this was one of those details that came out in marriage, the small inherited things, the pieces of the people who had shaped you that surfaced in unexpected moments. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, in the room Etta kept as her own, which was the largest and the best. The guests had been rerouted for the week. The house was quiet. The September night was warm and the window was open and the prairie dark was out there, immense and breathing. She lay in the dark next to her husband, Henry Garrison, this man who had been in her doorway before she finished saying his name, and felt the extraordinary ordinariness of it, the way a life-changing thing becomes in the first night of being real, simply and profoundly real. "Are you awake?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you happy?" she said. A pause that was so brief as to be almost nothing. "More than I know what to do with," he said. She turned toward him in the dark. "I suggest you get used to it," she said. "I intend to," he said. The first year of their marriage was a year of building, in every sense. Henry moved into the boarding house, which made more practical sense than Etta moving to the homestead, though they kept his property as well, and he went out most days to tend the garden and the bees and the slow beginning of the small apple orchard he had started from saplings. The boarding house was expanded. They added 2 more rooms to the back of the building that autumn, Henry doing most of the carpentry himself, which he was good at in the same way he was good at everything: patient and precise and thorough. Etta managed the accounts and the kitchen and the guests, and Henry helped where an extra pair of hands was useful, which was more often than either of them had anticipated. They were good together in the daily domestic sense, which was not guaranteed even when people loved each other, and which was something Etta had wondered about. They had compatible habits. They both woke early. They were both comfortable with silence. They did not need to fill every moment with speech, and they did not have the kind of marriage where speech was used as a weapon or a defense. When they disagreed, and they did disagree, they were both too direct not to. They disagreed clearly and talked it through, and came to resolutions that both of them could live with, which was the only kind of resolution that was going to work for 2 people of that particular temperament. Henry continued to be involved in town affairs in the way that the water project had opened up. He was consulted on the new schoolhouse construction in the spring of 1880, and his suggestions about the roof angle and the stove placement were so practically useful that the school board asked him to oversee the whole build, which he did. Miss Perkins, the school teacher, who had been slightly overwhelmed by everything when Etta first met her, had by now settled into Caldwell and was thriving, and she was effusive in her gratitude to both of them in a way that was genuine and a little exhausting. Etta joined the town committee that was formed to address the issue of the cattle company's treatment of the land east of town. The trail drives were tearing up the soil badly, and there were downstream water effects that needed to be managed, and she was a formidable presence on that committee, which surprised no one who knew her. The cattle companies did not find her easy, which was exactly what the committee needed. In the spring of 1880, they received news that the Hardin Brothers Cattle Company, which had tried to take Henry's land the previous year, had been found to be involved in fraudulent land claims in 3 Kansas counties, and that the principals of the company were facing legal consequences in Wichita. Etta read the letter from the county attorney aloud at the breakfast table, and Henry sat across from her with his coffee and listened and said, at the end of it, "Good." "Good," she agreed. They exchanged a look that contained the memory of 6 weeks of kitchen table work and dozens of letters, and a fair amount of anxiety that neither of them had fully expressed at the time, and the satisfaction of the outcome, and the particular pleasure of justice arriving, even delayed, even small. That summer, Etta discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Henry on a warm June evening on the back porch, where they had taken to sitting in the long summer evenings the way they had sat on the creek bank in the beginning, comfortably and companionably, and with the prairie spread out dark and enormous before them, the stars coming out one by one overhead. She simply told him. She was not one for elaborate arrangements or dramatic announcements. She said it plainly, and then she watched his face. His face did something extraordinary, something entirely unguarded and entirely full. He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched him absorb it, the way he absorbed things, fully, from the inside out, not in the performed way of a person who wants to be seen having a feeling, but in the real way of a person actually having one. "Etta," he said, and his voice was different from any way she had heard it before, soft and certain and containing something very large. "Yes," she said. He reached over and covered her hand with his, the same gesture from the kitchen table in January, full circle, she thought, everything full circle. "Are you well?" he said. "How are you feeling?" "I am well," she said, "tired in the mornings. The smell of coffee is currently my enemy." "I will make different arrangements in the mornings," he said immediately. She laughed. "Henry, I run a boarding house. The guests want coffee. I will arrange it so you are not near the kitchen when the coffee is on," he said, in the tone of a man who has already decided this and considers it settled. "You are already planning," she said. "I am always planning," he said. She turned her hand over and held his. "A baby," she said. "Our baby," he said. They sat on the porch in the summer dark, and the stars were very bright, and the coyotes sang to each other somewhere south, and Etta felt the shape of her life around her, the house behind them warm and full, the prairie before them open and alive, the man beside her steady and real and entirely hers, and the new life beginning, small and certain, already changing everything. Their son was born in February of 1881. In a Kansas winter that had frozen the ground hard as iron and left the roads buried, and the town pulled inward on itself. He arrived in the small hours of a Tuesday morning, and Clara Hodges was there as Etta had arranged, and the doctor from Wichita had been brought through ahead of the worst weather, and Henry was in the next room, not sleeping, not pretending to sleep, simply present. When Clara came to the door and told him he could come in, he went in and he saw Etta, tired and flushed and completely alive in some absolute way, and the baby she was holding, red-faced and small-fisted and thoroughly new, and he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them for a long, full moment without speaking. "Hello," Etta said, which was what she had said to him on the porch in the spring, and which she said again now with intention. He understood. He looked at her with everything he was. "Hello," he said. They named the boy Thomas James Garrison Thomas for Henry's father, James for Etta's husband who had gone before, because you did not have to choose between honoring your past and living in your present, and Etta had always known that. Tom was a loud and vigorous baby who had Henry's dark hair and Etta's green eyes, and who almost immediately developed strong opinions about the schedule of his meals, which was, Henry said with some amusement, deeply characteristic of his mother. The boarding house adapted around the baby, the way it had adapted around everything. The guests, most of whom were regulars, treated Tom's presence with a mixture of affection and mild bewilderment. And the town of Caldwell received the news of the Garrison baby with the warm, community-minded enthusiasm that small towns bring to births, which meant a great deal of food left on the front porch and old Mr. Farrow appearing with a carved wooden horse that he had apparently been making since September. "I had a feeling," he said when he gave it to Etta, "it was going to be a boy." Henry, standing behind Etta's shoulder, made a quiet sound that was very close to a laugh. Life continued. The cattle trade shifted as the railroad expanded and new routes developed, and Caldwell's particular position on the trail made it for a time one of the most active cattle shipping points in Kansas. The boarding house thrived. The apple orchard on the western property began to actually produce apples by 1882, and Etta added apple preserves to her operation, which turned out to be so good that she had orders coming in from 3 neighboring towns. Henry had quietly become one of the most relied-upon men in Caldwell, the person the mayor's office called when something needed building or fixing or thinking through, the person other farmers came to when they had questions about their water or their land. He was not famous for it. He did not seek the recognition, but it was known, and it was real. Tom grew from a loud, vigorous baby into a loud, vigorous toddler who pursued the boarding house cat with unrelenting determination, and who had the particularly terrifying quality of being afraid of nothing, which Henry said was also characteristic of his mother. "I am appropriately afraid of things," Etta said. "Name one thing you are afraid of," Henry said. She thought about it. "Badly sourced flour," she said. He laughed. He had a good laugh, full and real and not used carelessly, which meant that when she heard it she still felt it land the same way it had the first time, warm and unexpected. "That does not count," he said. "It absolutely counts," she said. "Badly sourced flour affects everything." In 1882 they had a second child, a girl this time, which was its own particular joy. They named her Sarah Me Garrison, and she arrived in October with more composure than Tom had managed at birth. She regarded the world from the very beginning with a steady, considering look that made Henry say, quietly, the first time he held her, that she was going to be a great deal of trouble. "The best kind," Etta said. "Yes," he said, "the best kind." There was a moment, on a Thursday afternoon in November of 1882, that Etta would afterward think of as one of the most complete moments of her life. She was in the kitchen, Sarah on her hip in the easy way you carry a second child that you could not have imagined with the first, Tom playing on the kitchen floor with the carved wooden horse that had survived a year and a half of determined use. Henry was at the kitchen table, going over the books for the apple preserve operation, which had become formal enough to warrant books. The fire was good. There was bread in the oven. The late afternoon light came through the kitchen window in long, gold bars. She looked at all of it, the room, the children, the man at the table who looked up at exactly that moment and found her watching him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Everything." He looked at her with those dark eyes. "Good everything or complicated everything?" "Good everything," she said. "Entirely good." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he put down his pen and pushed back his chair and came across the kitchen to her. He took Sarah carefully from her hip and held the baby against his shoulder with one arm, and with his other hand he brushed a strand of Etta's hair back from her face with a touch so gentle and so sure that she felt it from her scalp to the soles of her feet. "It is good," he said. "You were right about that." Tom looked up from the floor with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair and said, "Papa, horse," with the imperious clarity of a 2-year-old. And Henry looked down at him and said, "I see the horse, Tom," with the perfect seriousness of a man who respects 2-year-olds' concerns. And Etta laughed, and Sarah made a small contented sound against Henry's shoulder. There it was. All of it, right there in one kitchen on a Thursday afternoon in November, in a cattle town in Kansas in 1882. She thought about the night of the meeting, that October a few years ago. The room full of people trying to solve a problem. Herself going through names like nails in a box. And landing on his name, Henry Garrison. The man nobody had thought to invite, the man she had thought to invite, the man who had been in the doorway before she finished saying his name. She had not known in that moment what she was starting. She had thought she was solving a water problem. She had been, in the deepest sense, solving a loneliness she had not fully acknowledged she was living inside. And she had done it by saying the name of a man who had apparently been waiting, in the quiet and self-sufficient way of a man who expected nothing and hoped carefully for someone to say it. The water still ran clean in Caldwell, through the channel he had dug and the pipe he had laid, and the care he had given to something the rest of the town had not yet thought to address. And her life ran clean and full the same way because she had said his name, and he had come. Clara came to supper that Friday, as she did most Fridays when Tom was not away on some trip or another, and she sat at the table with Tom on her lap being charmed by his very best tricks, which included a credible frog noise, and Sarah in the basket by the fire, and Etta at the stove, and Henry bringing in the last of the firewood for the evening, stamping the cold off his boots at the door. "You know," Clara said conversationally, watching Henry cross the kitchen with the wood, "the Pratt family was talking about you at the store this week." "About me specifically," Henry said, setting the wood by the stove. "About you and Etta, about the whole thing. Mrs. Pratt said she still cannot believe she never thought to include you in anything for those 3 years. She said it as though it were a personal failing." "It was not personal," Henry said. "Nobody was unkind." "No, but they were thoughtless," Etta said from the stove, "which is its own kind of unkindness if you let it go on long enough." Henry looked at her. "It did not go on too long," he said. "It went on exactly long enough for me to be the one to say your name," she said. "I am not ungrateful for the timing." He came to stand beside her at the stove, close enough that their arms touched, and looked at the pot she was stirring with the same attention he gave everything. "Neither am I," he said. Clara watched this exchange with the expression of a woman who has been watching a love story develop from the very first scene and who has never once tired of it. She hugged Tom a little tighter and said nothing because sometimes the things you love most do not need commentary. By 1883, the apple orchard on the western property was one of the most productive in the county. Etta had expanded the preserve operation to include a small commercial enterprise, with orders going out to Wichita and even once to Kansas City, which felt like a remarkable thing. Henry had been asked twice to consult on irrigation projects in neighboring towns, which he did, and which had a modest but real economic benefit for the Garrison household on top of the boarding house income. They were, by the standards of their time and place, prosperous. Not wealthy, but secure and comfortable, and building something that had roots. Tom was 3.5 and had the horse memorized, and could name every part of it that old Mr. Farrow had carved into the wood. Old Mr. Farrow himself, who came to supper regularly, and who had been folded into the family in the particular way of elderly neighbors who have no family left and who fill the space perfectly, had turned 80 and was slower but entirely present, still had opinions about Missouri mules and the drought of 1872, and was teaching Tom to play checkers with a patience that astonished everyone who knew him. Sarah, at 1 year old, had achieved standing and was working on walking with the same steady, considering approach she had brought to everything since birth. She would pull herself to standing on the kitchen table leg and regard the distance between herself and the next piece of furniture with such careful assessment that Henry had taken to calling her the surveyor, which Etta found inappropriately amusing. The town of Caldwell itself was changing, the way all Kansas cattle towns changed in that decade. The lawless, wild trade quality of the early years was slowly giving way to something more settled, more civic, more permanent. The cattle trail was still active, but the railroad's reach was expanding, and the industry was shifting. People were thinking about schools and churches and roads, about the kind of community you built for children, not just the kind you built for commerce. Henry had become, quietly and without ever seeking it, one of the people the town looked to when it was making those decisions. He attended the town meetings now, every one of them, and he spoke when he had something worth saying, which meant that when he did speak, people listened. Etta was there beside him at most of those meetings, and between the two of them they had a kind of calm, clear-eyed influence that did not call attention to itself, but was genuinely effective. She thought about him, sometimes, across a crowded room full of her neighbors, the way she had thought about him at that first gathering after the water project. She thought about how different the room felt with him in it. Not just to her, though certainly to her, but in the more general sense. The quality of the room changed when Henry Garrison was present, because he brought a kind of attentiveness and competence and honest engagement that raised the level of what was possible in a conversation. You could not sit next to him and be lazy in your thinking. He would not contradict you. He was not that kind of man, but his own precision was contagious. She had told him this once, and he had looked at her with such disbelief that she had laughed. "You do not see yourself clearly," she said. "I see myself well enough," he said. "You see yourself as someone who should not impose," she said. "That is not the same thing as seeing yourself clearly." He was quiet for a moment. "You changed that," he said. She shook her head. "You changed it. I just said your name." "Etta," he said, with the particular tone he had for when he was about to be very direct and also very private about something. "You said my name, and I walked through a door I had been standing outside for 3 years. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing." She looked at him. She felt the familiar pull of love, not the early anxious version, not the careful hope of the first months, but the deep, settled, thoroughly known version of it. The love that has been through winters and arguments and a fraudulent land claim and 2 children and a decade of Kansas weather, and that has come through all of it more solid and more true than before. "All right," she said. "Maybe it was the whole thing." "It was," he said. In the spring of 1884, they planted a new section of the orchard together, Henry digging the holes with the precise spacing he had calculated, Etta lowering the young apple trees in, Tom, now 4, attending with great seriousness, and contributing several opinions about which trees should go where that were not particularly relevant, but were stated with such conviction that they were listened to respectfully. Sarah, who was walking confidently now, followed her brother around the orchard with the surveying gaze, and occasionally sat down deliberately in the dirt. It was a Saturday, and the sky was the vivid spring blue of Kansas at its best, and the meadowlarks were everywhere, and the air smelled of turned earth and possibility, and Etta stood up from tamping the soil around the sixth tree and looked at her husband and her children and her property and the orchard they were making together, and felt the completeness of it so fully that it was almost overwhelming. Henry looked up from the tree he was working on and saw her face. "What is it?" he said. "I was just thinking," she said, "that the morning light here is very good." He held her gaze, and understanding moved across his face, the understanding of a man who recognizes a reference to his own words, returned to him as a gift. He had said years ago that he had stayed in Caldwell for the morning light, that it had seemed worth staying for. She was telling him, in the way that you tell a person when you know them well enough not to need many words, that she understood why. He came across the orchard to her and kissed her, briefly and warmly, which made Tom say, "Mama, Papa, tree," with some impatience, and Sarah fall over again in the dirt, and both of them laughed, and Henry picked Sarah up and Etta took Tom's hand, and they went back to planting the orchard in the spring light. Clara brought her newest baby to visit the following week. She and Tom had a boy of their own now, born the previous winter, and the two babies regarded each other from their respective positions with the mutual assessment of very young humans, and sat at the kitchen table while Etta put the kettle on, and looked at the kitchen with its hanging herbs and its familiar warmth, and at Etta moving around it with the ease of a woman completely at home in her own life. "Are you happy?" Clara asked. It was a simple question and it deserved a simple answer. "Yes," Etta said. "I am absolutely happy." Clara nodded, satisfied. "Good," she said. "You should be." Henry came in from outside with Tom on his shoulders and mud on both their boots, and set the boy down at the kitchen door, and made him take the boots off before he ran inside, which Tom did with the dramatic suffering of a child being asked to do something entirely reasonable. Henry caught Etta's eye across the kitchen, and she raised her eyebrows at the mud, and he shrugged one shoulder in the way that meant, "I tried," and she shook her head in the way that meant, "I know you did." Clara watched this silent exchange with the satisfied expression of a woman who had been watching it develop for 5 years, and who expected to watch it for 50 more. That evening, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet and the late spring night was warm enough to leave the bedroom window open, Etta lay in the dark and listened to Henry's breathing beside her, slow and steady and real. She thought about the night of the meeting, the lantern light in the crowded room and the murmuring of people hoping someone else would solve their problem. Her own mind going through names, landing on his. She thought about his face in the doorway, the hat in both hands, the dark eyes finding hers. She thought about the creek running clean now, about the orchard growing, about Tom's carved horse on the shelf, about Sarah's steady, considering eyes. About 11 days of digging in the Kansas soil, and 6 weeks of letters to Wichita, and 2 years of mornings with coffee, and a man who listened with his whole attention and who had, in the particular silent language of people who love each other, been saying "I love you" since the moment she said his name. "Henry," she said softly. "I am awake," he said, in the way of a man who had not been asleep. "You said once that the morning light was why you stayed," she said. "I did. Is that still why?" A pause, and in it all the years, all the water and the cold and the orchards and the children and the kitchen table and the creek and the porch and the whole ordinary, extraordinary life they had built. "No," he said. "It has not been the light for a long time." She was quiet. "You said my name," he said. "I came through the door. Everything after that is why I stay." She found his hand under the covers and held it, and the night was warm and the stars were out and the town of Caldwell was quiet around them, and the creek ran clean and the orchard grew, and the two of them lay in the dark of their home that they had made together, and the story of how he came to be there. The man nobody had thought to invite, who she had thought to invite, who had been there before she finished the sentence, was not a beginning anymore. It was simply the whole of everything. The foundation of a life that had been built on one good instinct and one said name and a man who had been waiting at the door, without knowing he was waiting, for someone to think of him and say, "Come in." He was there. He was entirely there. And so was she. And the morning light, when it came, was every bit as good as he had always said.